Hello viewers, I am going to start the part B of the module Theories of Policy Analysis, Theoretical Approaches. After reading this unit, you will be able to understand various theoretical approaches to policy analysis and their implications. Introduction. Public policy process is a highly complex and arduous one involving several aspects and dimensions and being influenced by number of factors. It is important to understand the policy process in all its dimensions. Various scholars of public administration have tried to do this and in an attempt to do so have developed theoretical approaches. Even though each theoretical approach is significant in itself, but some approaches are more influential than others. Starting with elite theory. Approached from the perspective of elite theory, public policy can be regarded as reflecting the values and preferences of governing elite. The essential argument of elite theory is that public policy is not determined by the demands and actions of the people or the masses, but rather by a ruling elite whose preferences are carried into effect by public officials and agencies. Professors Thomas Dye and Harmon Ziegler provide a summary of elite theory. First, society is divided into the few who have power and the many who do not have it. Only a small number of persons allocate values for society. The masses do not decide public policy. Second, the few who govern are not typical of the masses that are governed. Elites are drawn disproportionately from the upper socio-economic strata of society. Third, the movement of non-elites to elite positions must be slow and continuous to maintain stability and avoid revolution. Only non-elites who have accepted the basic elite consensus can be admitted to governing circles. Fourth, elites share consensus on the basic value of the social system and the preservation of the system. The elite consensus includes private enterprise, private property, limited government and individual liberty. Fifth, public policy does not reflect demands of masses, but rather the prevailing values of the elite. Changes in public policy will be incremental rather than revolutionary. Incremental changes permit responses to events that threaten a social system with a minimum of alteration or dislocation of the system. Sixth, elites may act out of narrow self-serving motives and risk undermining mass support, or they may initiate reforms, curb abuse and undertake programs to preserve the system and their place in it. Seventh, active elites are subject to relatively little direct influence from apathetic masses. Elites influence masses more than masses influence elites. As stated, elite theory is a challenging theory of formation. Policy is the product of elites, reflecting their values and serving their ends, one of which may be desire to provide in some way for the welfare of the masses. Elite theory focuses our attention on the role of leadership in policy formation and on the reality that in any political system a few govern the many. Whether elites rule and determine policy with little influence from the masses is a difficult proposition to handle. It cannot be proved merely by assertions that the establishment runs things, which has been a familiar plaint in recent years. Political scientist Robert Dahl argues that to defend the proposition successfully, one must identify a controlling group less than a majority in size that is not a pure artifact of democratic rules, a minority of individuals whose preferences regularly prevail in cases of differences of preferences on key political issues. It may be that elite theory has more utility for analysis and explanation of policy formation in some political systems, such as developing or Eastern European countries, than in others, such as the pluralist democracies of the United States and Canada. Next, coming to institutional approach. The study of government institutions or organizations is one of the oldest concerns of political science. This is not surprising, since political life generally revolves around governmental institutions such as legislatures, executive, courts, and political parties. Public policy, moreover, is authoritatively determined and implemented by these institutions. Traditionally, the institutional approach concentrated on describing the more formal and legal aspects of governmental institutions, their formal structure, legal powers, procedural rules and functions or activities. Formal relationships with other institutions might also be considered, such as legislature-executive relations. Usually, little was done to explain how institutions actually operated as opposed to how they were supposed to operate, to analyze public policies produced by the institutions, or to discover the relationships between institutional structure and public policies. Subsequently, political scientists turned their attention in teaching and research to the political processes within governmental or political institutions, concentrating on the behavior of participants in the process and on political realities rather than formalism. In the study of the legislatures, interest shifted from simply describing the legislature as an institution to analyzing and explaining its operation over time, from its static to its dynamic aspects. Thus, in the academic curriculum, the course on the legislature often came to be about the legislative process. Institutionalism, with its emphasis on the formal or structural aspects of institutions, can nonetheless be usefully employed in policy analysis. An institution is in part a set of regularized patterns of human behavior that persist over time and perform some significant social function or activity. It is their differing patterns of behavior that really distinguish courts from legislatures, from administrative agencies, and so on. These regularized patterns of behavior, which we often call rules or structures, can affect decision making and the content of public policy. Rules and structural arrangements are usually not neutral in their effects. Rather, they tend to favor some of the Senate rules and traditions which often have the effect of rules, such as those relating to unlimited debates and action by unanimous consent, favor the interests of legislative minorities over majorities. Many actions in the Senate, such as bringing bills up for consideration and closing of debate on them, are done by unanimous consent. In the American federal system, which allocates governmental power among the national and state governments, several arenas of action are created. Some groups may have more influence if policy is made at the national level, whereas others may benefit more from state policy making. Civil rights groups, for example, have received a better response in Washington, D.C. than in the capitals of the southern states. Groups advocating adoption of English as the nation's official language, however, have fared better at the state level. Between 1983 and 1997, 20 states adopted such laws, but the Congress has been unsympathetic. Indeed, the Voting Rights Act provides that in some states ballots must be printed in foreign language as well as English. Next, rational choice theory. The rational choice theory, which is sometimes called social choice or formal theory, originated with economists and involves applying the principles of microeconomic theory to the analysis and explanation of political behavior or non-market decision making. It has now gained many adherents among political scientists. Perhaps the earliest use of rational choice theory to study the political process is Anthony Downs' Economic Theory of Democracy. In his influential book, Downs assumes that voters and political parties act as rational decision makers who seek to maximize attainment of their preferences. Parties formulated whatever policies would win those most votes, and voters sought to maximize the portion of their preferences that could be realized through government action. In attempting to win elections, political parties moved towards the center of the ideological spectrum to appeal to the greatest number of voters and maximize their voting support. Thus, rational choice theory both alerts us to the importance of self-interest as a motivating force in politics and policy making and provides us a better understanding of decision-making processes. Many contend, however, that politics is not nearly as devoid of altruism and concern for the public interest as the rational choice theorists assume. The adoption of good public policy, for example, is frequently a goal of members of the Congress and public interest groups, such as the National Wildlife Federation, are motivated by more than immediate self-interest. Next, class theory. The class theory is most closely associated with the works of Marx and Engels. The main proposition of the class theory is that public policies in a capitalist society reflect the values and interests of the dominant and ruling class. It states that capitalist societies are characterized by the presence of classes that have opposing values and interests. According to Lenin, the large groups of people differing from each other by the place they occupy in a historically determined system of social production by their relation to the means of production, by their role in social organizations of labor, and consequently by the dimensions of the share of social wealth of which they dispose and the mode of acquiring it. The class theory argues that the mode of production and distribution in every society defines the character of the society. Thus, the class to which an individual belongs could be identified on the basis of his role in the social organization of labor and his position to the means of production. Two broad classes have been identified by the class theory, the bourgeois and the proletariat. The bourgeois are the owners of the means of production, while the proletariat is the working class whose labor is often exploited by the bourgeois. According to the class theory, conflict between these two classes is inherent in the capitalist society. According to Marx, the history of class struggle, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another. These conflicts often arise due to resistance of the proletariat to exploitation by the bourgeois. The class theory argues that the bourgeois, due to their economic power, also control political power and use it to protect their socio-economic interests. This is often reflected in the type of policies they make. Thus, public policies often reflect the interests of the bourgeois. On the other hand, the proletariats attempt to influence public policies to their advantage through industrial conflict, such as strikes, work to rule, etc. Next, political systems theory. The political systems theory is most closely associated with the work of David Easton, 1953. According to this model, public policy is the response of the political system to demands arising from its environment. The political system, as defined by Easton, composed of those identifiable and interrelated institutions and activities in a society that make authoritative allocation of values that are binding on society. The environment consists of all those socio-cultural, economic and political conditions or factors within and outside the boundaries of the political system which shape the political process and whose activities are influenced by the political system. The political system receives inputs from the environment. Inputs consist of demands and supports. Demands are the claims made by individuals and groups on the political system for action to satisfy their interests. Support is rendered when groups and individuals abide by the rules or laws of the country, pay their taxes and accept the decisions and actions of the authoritative political system made in response to demands. The amount of support for a political system indicates the extent to which it is regarded as legitimate or as authoritative and binding on its citizens. Output of the political system include laws, rules, judicial decisions and the like. These authoritative allocations of values constitute public policy. The concept of feedback indicates that the political system receives information about the policy outcomes and public policies or outputs made at a given time may subsequently alter the environment and the demands arising therefrom, as well as the character of the political system itself. Policy outputs may produce new demands which lead to further outputs and so on in a never-ending flow of public policy. The usefulness of systems theory in studying public policy is limited by its highly general and abstract nature. It does not, moreover, say much about the procedures and processes by which decisions are made and policy is developed within the black box called the political system. Indeed, systems theory depicts government as simply responding to demands made upon it, and its results are sometimes characterized as input-output studies. The political systems theory has certain limitations. First, it does not explain the origin of public policies, nor is it concerned with how decisions are made and policies are developed within the political system. Again, it is not concerned with the evaluation of the past and present policies. Nonetheless, systems theory is a useful aid in organizing our inquiry into policy formulation. Systems theory draws our attention to the influence of inputs on the content of public policy. It also alerts us to some important facets of the political process, such as these. How do inputs from the environment affect the content of public policy and the operation of the political system? How in turn does public policy affect the environment and subsequent demands for policy action? How well is the political system able to convert demands into public policies and preserve itself over time? Next, policy process approach. The most commonly adopted approach is to identify stages in the policy process and then to analyze the determinants of each particular stage. In the policy process approach, problems are first recognized as issues for action, and then policies are adopted and implemented by officials, then evaluated and finally terminated or changed on the basis of their success or the lack of it. Certainly, the process is much more complex than its rather simple image. But when we speak of the policy cycle, we are speaking about the political process through which most public policy passes. Next, substantive theory. Many policy scientists become substantive specialists in particular area. For example, they may analyze the determinants of environmental policy formulation, implementation or change. Others become educational policy specialists, healthcare policy specialists, energy policy specialists, crime policy specialists or welfare policy specialists. These individuals may stay within the context of a single substantive area for much of their professional careers, or alternatively they may delve in a policy in a particular area for a short time and later move on to yet another policy area. Some policy scientists argue that substantive knowledge is not necessary to be a good policy analyst. Instead, they argue that one need only to be skilled in the process and method of public policy. Substance is relatively unimportant. Next, econometric approach. The econometric approach, sometimes called the public choice approach or the political economy approach, is primarily based on economic theories of politics in which human nature is assumed to be rational or motivated for preference gain. This approach assumes that people pursue their own fixed weighted preferences regardless of collective outcomes. Essentially, it integrates the general insight of public research with the method of public finances. For example, it assumes that preferences of individuals are narrow and diverse, which require that these individuals aggregate or log roll their preferences into majorities that can command governmental action. Next, logical positivist approach. The logical positive approach, often called the behavioral approach or the scientific approach, advocates the use of deductively derived theories, models, hypothesis testing, hard data, comparative method, and rigorous statistical analysis. Next, phenomenological or post-positivist approach. Recent years have seen growing disenchantment with utility of scientific methods, including logical positivism and econometric approach in the study of public policy. Those who oppose the scientific study of public policy prefer an approach whereby intuition is more important than positivist or scientific approach. This approach is called the phenomenological, naturalistic or post-positivist approach. Next, participatory approach. The participatory approach, recently associated with Peter de Leon and others, is closely related to the post-positivist challenge and involves a greater inclusion of the interests and values of the various stakeholders in the policy decision-making processes. It is presumably closer to what Harold Laswell called the policy sciences of democracy, in which an extended population of affected citizens would be involved in the formulation and implementation of public policy through a series of discursive dialogues. It would involve extensive open hearings with a broad range of concerned citizens, in which these hearings would be structured in such a way as to prompt individuals, interest groups and agency officials to contribute to policy design and redesign. The declared purpose of participatory policy analysis is to gather information so that policy makers can make better, that is, more completely informed recommendations and decisions. As an approach to analysis, it encourages consideration of a greater number of players and values in the policy making process and to thus have a better catalogue of the various perspectives being brought to bear on the policy under consideration. Next approach is ideological approach. Thomas Sowell calls the ideological approaches as visions and identifies two competing perspectives. The constrained vision is a picture of egocentric human beings with moral limitations. The fundamental social and moral challenge, therefore, is to make the best of possibilities that exist within that constraint rather than to dissipate energies in a vain attempt to change human nature. By this logic, then, one should rely on incentives rather than dispositions to obtain the desired behavior. The prospect of rewards or the fear of punishments provides the incentives to obtain desirable behavior. Fundamentally, then, This results in a conservative view of human nature and will lead to more conservative policy positions if one assumes that the primary constraints come from within the individual rather than being imposed from the environment outside the individual. The unconstrained vision, on the other hand, provides a view of human nature in which understanding and human dispositions are capable of intentionally creating social benefits. This view of human then is often associated with the liberal view that human nature is no constraint. Rather, constraints are imposed by the environment outside the individual. Next model is implementation market exchange model. Implementation market exchange model believes in a free market with minimum regulations by the state in the affairs and a lot of public-private partnership as well as a lot of private organizations taking over the functions of the government and directing the policy making. It is believed that this will lead to higher competition and thus higher economic growth, and this in turn will benefit the government in making available funds for its policies. Next, critic of policy approaches and models. Under this model, certain institutions in society are seen as competent institutions for determining public policy objectives and processes. The institutions are chosen on the basis of democratic participation, bureaucratic specification, and judicial adjudication. The functions performed by these certain institutions are the most major determining factor to implement various policies. This model also specifies and suggests the relationship between various institutions and how they all work together and collectively contribute to a successful policy implementation. There are numerous approaches of policy analysis which analyze policy process from their distinctive perspective. Each approach has its own strengths and weaknesses, but all of them are highly useful for providing greater insights. First, discuss the assumptions of elite theory of policy making. Second, discuss the contribution of David Easton in policy analysis. Third, discuss the significance of econometric approach and ideological approach.